The night had settled over Baker Street with the softness rarely granted to London. A gentle fog drifted low along the cobblestones, curling itself around the iron legs of gas lamps, dimming their glow into warm halos. The city, so often restless and loud, seemed to have exhaled at last. Even the distant clatter of carriage wheels had faded into something softer, something almost dreamlike. If one were to stand still long enough, one might notice how quiet it truly was. Not silent, never silent, but quiet in the way a sleeping mind is quiet, full of distant movement, softened edges, and half-forgotten sounds. A single window, faintly illuminated, overlooked the street. Inside that room sat Sherlock Holmes. He did not move much. He rarely needed to. Seated in his familiar chair, angled slightly toward the fire, Holmes allowed the warmth to settle into the room in slow waves. The flames did not crackle loudly. Instead, they whispered, shifting gently as logs gave way to embers. Each flicker cast long, stretching shadows across the walls, shadows that moved like slow thoughts. Across from him, half hidden in the dim glow, sat Dr. John Watson. Watson had long since surrendered to sleep. His breathing was steady, untroubled, rising and falling in a quiet rhythm that blended with the ticking of the clock mounted on the wall. Occasionally he shifted ever so slightly in his chair, as though following some distant dream, one far removed from the concerns of waking life. Holmes observed all of this without turning his head. He listened to the fire, to the clock, to the city beyond the glass. Time passed, though it did so without urgency. Minutes seemed to stretch, not longer but wider, as though there was simply more room within them. Holmes rested his fingers lightly against one another, eyes half-lidded, not asleep, but not entirely engaged with the present either. There was, in such moments, a kind of stillness he valued above all cases, a stillness in which nothing demanded solving. Outside, the fog thickened just slightly, drifting across the street in slow, patient waves. A lone figure passed at the far end of the road, only a silhouette, blurred and indistinct. Their footsteps were soft, barely audible, absorbed quickly by the damp stone beneath them. Then, even that faded, and once again, Baker Street returned to its quiet. Holmes's gaze shifted, not toward anything in particular, but toward the space between sounds, the subtle pauses, the gentle absences. It was there that he often found what others overlooked. Not clues, not evidence, but patterns. Tonight, however, the pattern was different, not broken, not disturbed, simply unfamiliar. The clock ticked on, steady, unchanging. Yet beneath its rhythm, there lingered something else, something so faint it could not yet be named, a suggestion rather than a sound, a presence that did not intrude, but waited. Holmes did not react. He did not rise, nor did he reach for his coat or hat. Instead, he allowed the moment to remain exactly as it was, unanswered, unrushed, unrushed, unrushed. The fire settled lower, its light dimming into a softer glow. Shadows drew closer to the corners of the room, folding themselves quietly into stillness. Watson shifted once more in his sleep, exhaling slowly before returning to complete rest. And still, Holmes listened, not for what was obvious, but for what almost existed. Far away, somewhere beyond the reach of immediate perception, a sound began to form, so faint that it could have been imagined, so soft that it seemed to belong more to memory than to reality. Holmes's eyes opened just a fraction more, not in alarm, not in urgency, but in quiet recognition. Something was approaching, not quickly, not forcefully, but with a slow and deliberate certainty that matched the rhythm of the night itself. And though Baker Street remained calm, it was no longer entirely at rest. Inside the quiet rooms of 221B Baker Street, the night deepened without announcement. Nothing abrupt marked the passing of time. No sudden gust, no sharp sound. Only a gradual softening, as though the world itself were lowering its voice. The fire had settled into a bed of glowing embers, their light steady and low. Occasionally, a small flicker would rise and fall again, casting brief movements of shadow across the walls before returning to stillness. The warmth remained, gentle and consistent, wrapping the room in a quiet comfort. Sherlock Holmes had not changed his position, yet there was a subtle difference now. His posture, though relaxed, carried a quiet attentiveness, as if some distant thread had been noticed, but not yet followed. His fingers rested lightly against the arm of the chair, unmoving, while his gaze lingered somewhere beyond the immediate room. Across from him, Dr. John Watson remained asleep. His head had tilted slightly to one side, his breathing slow and even. The faint rise and fall of his chest matched the rhythm of the ticking clock on the wall. In sleep, his features had softened, free from the concerns that often accompanied their shared work. For a time, the two rhythms, the clock and Watson's breathing, seemed to merge into one. Tick, inhale, tick, exhale. The kind of quiet pattern that asked for nothing and offered everything. Holmes listened, not with urgency, but with patience. The sound from earlier, if it could be called a sound, had not returned, or perhaps it had never truly arrived. It lingered instead, at the very edge of awareness, like a thought one cannot quite recall. He shifted his gaze slightly toward the window. Beyond the glass, the fog pressed closer now, soft and persistent. It blurred the outlines of the street, turning familiar shapes into gentle suggestions. The gas lamps still glowed, but their light seemed more distant, as though seen through memory rather than sight. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, a subtle change, not outside, but within the silence itself. Holmes tilted his head just slightly. There it was again, not loud enough to disturb, not clear enough to define. A faint rhythm, so delicate that it blended almost perfectly with the ticking clock, so measured that it could be mistaken for imagination. Holmes did not rise. Instead, he allowed his breathing to slow, aligning himself with the quiet of the room, as though by becoming stiller, he might hear more clearly. Tick, inhale, tick, exhale. And beneath it, something else, a second pattern, soft, distant, even. It came not as a single sound, but as a sequence, a spacing, a repetition so gentle that it seemed to exist only when one was not actively listening for it. Holmes closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in rest, but in focus. Without sight, the room became simpler. The fire, the clock, Watson's breathing, all arranged themselves into layers of sound, and there, at the furthest edge, a quiet step, then another, far away, and the murderers. Holmes opened his eyes again. Though nothing in the room had changed, Watson slept on. The fire continued its low glow. The clock marked its steady passage through the night. And yet, beyond the walls of 221B Baker Street, something moved, not quickly, not aimlessly, but with a calm and deliberate pace that seemed almost familiar. Holmes leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged. He did not question the sound. He did not analyze it, at least not in the way he might have on any other night. Instead, he allowed it to exist, to repeat, to settle into the quiet, like a natural extension of it. Step, pause, step, pause, each one separated by the same gentle interval, each one softened by distance, and fog. There was no urgency in it, no sign of distress or intent, only movement, consistent, unbroken. Holmes's gaze returned to fire, watching as a small ember shifted and dimmed. The rhythm continued. So faint now, it could almost be lost, and yet it remained, patient, persistent, as though it had all the time in the world. Watson stirred slightly in his chair, a small shift of weight, a quiet breath drawn in and released again. For a brief moment, it seemed he might wake, but the stillness of the room held him, and he drifted no further. Holmes did not look toward him. He already knew. Instead, he listened once more to the distant pattern. Step, pause, step, pause, unchanging, unhurried. And though the night remained calm, it was no longer empty. Something had begun, not loudly, not suddenly, but gently, as all enduring things do. The clock upon the wall continued its steady course, its hands drawing closer to a quiet and unremarkable moment. 2 minutes passed, then 5, then 10. Time, within 221 B.B. Baker Street, did not rush forward. It unfolded. The fire had dimmed further now, its glow reduced to a soft, amber pulse. Shadows gathered more completely along the edges of the room, settling into corners where they no longer moved. The air itself felt warmer, heavier, as though it too had grown tired. Sherlock Holmes remained still, yet his awareness had sharpened, not outwardly, not in any visible tension, but inwardly, where attention becomes quieter and deeper. Across from him, John Watson exhaled slowly, shifting only enough to settle more comfortably into his chair. The rhythm of his breathing had grown even softer now, almost blending entirely with the room itself. Tick, inhale, tick, exhale, and beneath it, that other rhythm, still there, still steady. Holmes let his gaze drift once more toward the clock. Its face, pale in the dim light, revealed nothing unusual. The hands moved as they always did, marking each second without hesitation, without awareness of what else might share its cadence. But Holmes had begun to notice something, the space between the ticks, a subtle awareness of the interval, and within that interval, the footsteps, not overlapping, not interrupting, but aligning. As though the two rhythms had come to an understanding, the clock spoke, and somewhere far beyond the walls, something answered. Step, tick, pause, step, tick, pause. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in quiet recognition. Patterns, once found, rarely disappeared. They revealed themselves slowly, gently, though waiting for the mind to become still enough to receive them. He leaned forward just a fraction, resting his elbow against the arm of the chair, his fingers lightly touching his temple. The sound was clearer now, not louder, but closer, perhaps simply more present. The fog outside had thickened further, pressing softly against the window pane. It dulled the world beyond into faint shapes and distant light, as though Baker Street existed alone, separated from the rest of London by a veil of quiet. And through that veil, step, pause, unchanging, unhurried, Holmes rose, not abruptly, not with purpose that demanded urgency, but with the slow, deliberate motion of someone stepping into a moment they had already accepted. The floor beneath him gave the faintest creak, quickly swallowed by the softness of the room. Watson did not stir. Holmes crossed toward the window, each step measured, his presence no more disruptive than the drifting embers behind him. He stopped just short of the glass. For a moment, he did not look out. Instead, he listened once more, closer now. The rhythm had not changed, only its distance. Step, pause, step, pause. Holmes reached forward and gently parted the curtain. The world beyond revealed itself, but only partially. The fog lay thick across Baker Street, curling and shifting in slow, continuous motion. The gas lamps glowed dimly within it, their light diffused into soft halos that hovered rather than shone. The street itself appeared empty, no figure, no movement, no source. And yet, the footsteps continued. Holmes's gaze remained steady, tracing the line of the street as though following something unseen. There were no visible impressions on the cobblestones, no shadow passing through the mist, nothing to mark the presence of whatever moved, only the sound, now clearer, now nearer, and still, unchanged. Step, pause, step, pause. Holmes did not open the window. He did not call out. Instead, he simply stood there, observing what could not be seen, listening to what could barely be heard. Behind him the room remained as it had been, the fire dim, the clock steady, Watson asleep. But something had shifted, not in the world, but in the understanding of it. Holmes allowed the curtain to fall back into place, the fabric settling softly against the window frame. He turned slightly, his expression calm, his mind undisturbed. There was no alarm in him, no urgency to pursue, only a quiet acknowledgement. The pattern had arrived, fully, and it was no longer distant. As Holmes returned slowly toward his chair, the rhythm followed, not into the room, but along the street beyond, maintaining its steady course, as though it had always been there, unseen, unquestioned. Until now, he sat once more, the chair receiving him with familiar ease. The fire gave a final soft flicker. The clock continued. Tick, inhale, tick, exhale. And beneath it, step, pause, step, pause. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, not to rest, but to listen more completely. The night had not grown louder. It had simply revealed more of itself. And somewhere within that quiet unfolding, the hour approached, unmarked by anything but time, and yet certain, inevitable. 2:17, drawing nearer with every breath. The moment arrived without announcement. No chime marked it, no shift in the air declared its presence, and yet, within the quiet of 221B Baker Street, something aligned. The clock continued as it always had. Tick, 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 tick. But now, each second seemed to carry a deeper weight, as though time itself had slowed to observe what followed. Sherlock Holmes did not open his eyes immediately. He did not need to. He could feel it, not as a disturbance, but as a completion. The pattern, once distant, once faint, had now settled fully into the present moment. 2:17. And with it, step, pause, step, pause, no longer far away, no longer softened by distance. The sound had drawn nearer to Baker Street, close enough now that it no longer blended with imagination. It existed clearly, gently pressing itself into the quiet of the night. Holmes opened his eyes. The room remained unchanged, the fire low and steady, the shadows still and patient. Across from him, John Watson remained asleep, his breathing undisturbed, untouched by the subtle shift that had taken place. Holmes listened. The footsteps were distinct now, not loud, never loud, but certain, each one placed with the same measured care, as though following a path long memorized. Step, pause, step, pause. They moved along the street just beyond the window. Holmes rose once more, this time without hesitation, though still without urgency. His movement carried the same calm rhythm as the sound itself, as though he were not approaching it, but meeting it. The floor beneath him gave a soft acknowledgement, then fell silent again. He reached the window and paused. For a brief moment, He allowed the sound to continue without interference. Step, pause. Step, pause. Closer still. Then slowly he lifted the latch. Rundle felt but the faintest whisper, the cool night air slipping gently into the room. It carried with it the scent of damp stone and distant rain, fresh and quiet. Holmes stepped just slightly forward. Outside, Baker Street lay wrapped in fog. Gas lamps glowed faintly, their light barely reaching the ground. The street stretched out in both directions, empty, undisturbed, untouched, and yet the footsteps continued. Now unmistakably close, just beyond the threshold of the visible. Step, pause, step, pause. Holmes's gaze followed the sound, tracking its movement not by sight, but by rhythm. There, near the edge of the lamplight, then further along, then closer again, but nothing appeared. No shadow crossed the fog, no figure broke the stillness. The cobblestones remained bare, and still the steps persisted. Holmes stepped out onto the narrow landing, his presence merging with the quiet of the street. The air was cool, but not cold. Fog brushed lightly against his coat, drifting past as though it had somewhere else to be. He stood there, listening. The rhythm did not falter. It did not change pace. It did not acknowledge him. Step, pause, step, pause. Holmes lowered his gaze to the ground. The stones were damp, reflecting faint glimmers of lamplight. For a moment, they appeared untouched. Then, a subtle impression, so faint it might have been mist, a slight darkening where a foot might fall. Then none other, not formed fully, not lasting long, but present, appearing and fading in perfect time with a sound. Holmes watched, not with surprise, not with disbelief, but with understanding that had not yet fully formed. The impressions did not lead toward him, nor away. They simply passed, following a path that existed beyond visibility, guided by something deeper than tension. Step, pause, step, pause. The fog shifted gently, curling around the invisible movement, but never revealing it. Holmes remained still, allowing the pattern to unfold exactly as it wished. He did not interrupt. He did not pursue. Instead, he observed the way each step lined perfectly with the last, distance unchanged, timing unbroken, a routine, a memory. A motion repeated so many times that it no longer required a body to continue. Holmes's gaze softened slightly. There was no threat here, no urgency, only persistence, the kind that belongs not to the present, but to something that had once been. The footsteps moved past him now, continuing along Baker Street, fading slowly as they went, not disappearing, but becoming distant once more. Step, pause, step, pause. Holmes remained where he stood, watching the space where they had been. The fog closed gently behind them. The street returned to stillness. The lamplight held steady. For a moment, there was nothing, only the quiet. Then slowly Holmes turned back toward the window. Inside, the room awaited exactly as he had left it, warm, dim, unchanged. He stepped back in, closing the window softly behind him. The latch settled into place with a quiet certainty. The air within felt warmer now, enclosing him once more in its calm. Watson stirred faintly, but did not wake. Holmes returned to his chair, lowering himself into it with the same measured ease. The fire gave a gentle pulse. The clock continued its steady rhythm. Tick, inhale, tick, exhale. And beneath it, faint again now, distant once more. Step, pause, step, pause. Holmes closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen, as the pattern continued its quiet journey through the night. unbroken, unchanged, and no longer entirely unknown. The room settled once more into its familiar stillness. Within 2021B Baker Street, nothing appeared altered. The fire remained low, its glow steady and unintrusive. Shadows rested quietly along the walls, no longer shifting, as though they too had found their place for the night. Sherlock Holmes sat as before, composed and unmoving, and yet something within him had shifted, not in urgency nor in concern, but in recognition. Across the room, Dr. John Watson stirred. It was not sudden, not the kind of waking that breaks sleep, but the kind that slowly rises toward awareness. His fingers twitched slightly against the armrest, and his breathing changed, just enough to separate itself from the steady rhythm it had shared with the clock. Tick, inhale, tick, exhale, a pause. Then quietly, Watson opened his eyes. For a moment, he did not move. The dim light, the warmth of the fire, the soft weight of the night, all held him gently in place, as though inviting him to remain where he was. His gaze shifted slightly, adjusting to the room. Then he noticed Holmes, still seated, still calm, still listening. Watson blinked once, then again, his voice emerging softly, untouched by alarm. "Holmes, are you awake?" Holmes did not turn immediately. "Yes." The reply came quietly, as though it had been waiting. Watson shifted, sitting a little more upright, though not fully leaving the comfort of his chair. He listened for a moment, not quite knowing what had drawn him from sleep. At first, he heard nothing unusual, only the fire, only the clock, only the quiet. Then, something else, faint, distant, regular. Watson's brow furrowed slightly, not in fear, but in curiosity. "Do you hear that?" Holmes allowed a brief pause before answering. "I do." The two sat in silence, both listening now, not actively searching, but allowing the sound to present itself. Step, pause, step, pause. Watson's gaze drifted toward the window, though he did not rise. "It sounds like someone walking," he murmured. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Yes, but there is no one there. No." Watson exhaled slowly, the thought settling rather than unsettling. The footsteps continued, steady, measured, unchanging. Watson leaned back slightly, his eyes softening as he listened more closely. "There's something familiar about it," he said after a moment. Holmes' expression remained calm. "There is." Watson closed his eyes briefly, not in sleep, but in focus. Without sight, the rhythm became clearer. Step, pause, step, pause. "It is not wandering," Watson continued softly. "It is following a path." Holmes turned his gaze slightly toward him. "Precisely." Watson opened his eyes again, looking toward the dim outline of the window. "A routine," he said. Holmes gave the faintest nod. Yes." The room grew quieter still, as though acknowledging the understanding that had settled between them. Watson rested his head back, his voice thoughtful, distant. "Someone who walked that path often, at the same hour, night after night." Holmes did not respond immediately. The fire shifted gently. The clock continued, and beneath it, step, pause, step, pause. Watson's breathing slowed once more, though he remained awake. "It does not feel recent," he added. Holmes's eyes moved slightly, returning to the fire. No, there was no need to explain further. The sound carried its own meaning, not through clarity but through consistency. It did not belong to the present moment in the way ordinary sounds did. It existed alongside it, overlapping gently, without disruption. Watson's gaze softened. "It is peaceful," he said quietly. Holmes allowed a faint shift in expression. Not quite a smile, but something close. Yes. The footsteps continued, drifting gradually further along the street, their presence diminishing, not in certainty, but in distance. Step, pause, step, pause. Watson followed the sound for as long as he could, until it became too faint to separate from the night itself. Then, slowly, he exhaled and closed his eyes again, not from exhaustion, but from acceptance. "I think I understand," he murmured, his voice already fading back into rest. Holmes did not reply. He did not need to. The room held the silence gently, allowing it to settle once more into its natural rhythm. Tick, inhale. Tick, exhale. The fire dimmed further, its glow now little more than a soft presence in the darkness. Outside, the fog remained. The street lay still, and somewhere beyond immediate reach, the pattern continued, unbroken, unhurried, following its quiet path through the night. Holmes remained awake, listening, not for answers, but for continuity, for the gentle assurance that some things, once begun, do not end. They simply continue, in their own time and in their own way. And within Baker Street, the night carried on, calm, steady, and no longer unexplained. The night did not change. It deepened. Within 221B Baker Street, the last warmth of the fire settled into a quiet, enduring glow. No flames rose now, only embers, steady and patient, like a memory that refused to fade completely. Dr. John Watson had drifted back into sleep. His breathing returned to its gentle rhythm, slower now, heavier, as though the brief moment of waking had only drawn him deeper into rest. His head rested more comfortably against the chair, his features softened once again by the calm of the room. Tick, inhale, tick, exhale. Across from him, Sherlock Holmes remained awake. Not alert in the usual sense, not engaged in pursuit, but present, fully, quietly, present. The footsteps had faded earlier, not vanished, only withdrawn, like a tide slipping back into the distance, leaving behind only the memory of its rhythm. For a time there was nothing, only the clock, only the breathing, only the low, steady warmth. Holmes allowed his gaze to rest upon the floor between them, where shadows lay undisturbed. His mind did not race ahead. It did not dissect or reconstruct. Instead, it observed. The pattern, now familiar, did not ask to be solved. It asked only to be understood. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, not in rest, but in reflection. And within that quiet, the rhythm returned. Not outside, not along the street, but within thought. Step, pause, step, pause, measured, even, unchanging. Holmes's breathing adjusted, aligning unconsciously with the pattern. The space between each breath mirrored the space between each step until the two became indistinguishable. It was not imitation, it was recognition. He opened his eyes again, slowly, as though emerging from a place deeper than sleep. The room remained still. Watson slept. The embers glowed, but something had become clearer, not through evidence, not through sight, but through repetition. Holmes rose once more, this time with a softer motion than before, as though careful not to disturb even the silence itself. He moved toward the table near the window, where scattered papers rested beneath the dim light of a candle that had long since burned low. The wick flickered faintly, its light barely stronger than the embers behind him. Holmes reached for a small notebook, not with urgency, not with purpose that demanded completion, but with quiet intent. He opened it. The pages were mostly blank. He paused, listening, not outwardly, but inwardly, allowing the rhythm to settle once more into clarity. Step, pause, step, pause, and then gently he began to write, not words at first, but marks, small, precise indications of spacing, a dot, a line, a pause, another dot, another line, each one placed with care, mirroring the pattern exactly as it existed. The page began to fill, not with explanation, but with representation, a rhythm made visible. Holmes did not hurry. Each mark followed the next with the same measured calm as the footsteps themselves. There was no need to complete it quickly. The pattern would not change. It did not require correction, only observation. Behind him, Watson shifted slightly, though he did not wake. The room remained undisturbed. Holmes paused, lifting the pen from the page. He looked at what he had written. A sequence, unbroken, perfectly spaced, unaltered, and in that sequence, something revealed itself. Not a clue, not a solution, but a constancy. The distance between each mark, the time between each pause, identical. Again, and again, and again. Holmes closed the notebook gently. The sound was soft, barely present. He set it back upon the table and allowed his hand to rest there for a moment longer. Then slowly he turned toward the window once more. The fog remained, unchanged. The street beyond invisible in its depth, but Holmes no longer needed to see it. The path was known, not visually, but rhythmically. He stepped closer, stopping just before the glass. And for a moment, nothing, only stillness. Then, faint, distant, again, but unmistakable. Step, pause, step, pause. It had returned, not nearer, not further, exactly where it had been before, following the same path, at the same pace, as though no time had passed at all. Holmes did not open the window this time. He did not step outside. Instead, he remained where he was, listening with a quiet acceptance that required no further action. The pattern would continue, whether observed or not, whether understood or not. It did not depend on him. An act, perhaps, was its most defining quality. Holmes exhaled slowly, his breath fading into the quiet of the room. Behind him, the embers dimmed further. The clock continued. Tick, inhale, tick, exhale, and beyond. Step, pause, step, pause. Unchanged, unending. A path walked not by presence, but by memory. And as the night carried on within Baker Street, the rhythm remained, steady, certain, and quietly eternal. The rhythm continued, not as something new, but as something remembered. Within 2221B Baker Street, the final traces of the fire had softened into a faint, enduring glow. The room no longer flickered with light, only a steady warmth remained, gentle and constant. Sherlock Holmes stood near the window, unmoving. He did not watch. He listened. Beyond the glass, the fog had thinned just slightly, not enough to reveal the street entirely, but enough to suggest its shape. The gas lamps stood like quiet sentinels, their light dim but persistent, and somewhere along that softened stretch of stone, step, pause, step, pause. The sound no longer felt distant nor close. It simply existed, exactly where it belonged. Holmes closed his eyes once more, not in thought, not in effort, but in allowance. And in that stillness, something shifted, not outside, but within perception itself. The rhythm did not change, but the way it was heard did. The steps no longer seemed to move through the present moment. Instead, they unfolded as though layered, one upon another, reaching back through time. Step, pause, step, pause. And with each repetition, an image began to form, not sharply, not all at once, but gently, like fog lifting from memory. A street, the same street, Baker Street, though not as it was now, clearer, less worn, the lamps brighter, the air lighter, and upon that street a figure, not fully seen, not fully defined, but present, walking, step, pause, step, pause. Holmes did not open his eyes. He allowed the image to remain incomplete, to shape itself without interference. The figure moved with quiet familiarity, following a path so well known it required no thought, a routine, not performed once nor twice, but countless times, night after night, at the same hour, with the same pace, the same spacing, the same intention, not hurried, not delayed, simply consistent. The sound carried more now, not volume, but meaning. Each step felt anchored, as though placed not just upon stone, but upon time itself. Holmes's breathing slowed further, matching the rhythm once again. Step, inhale, pause, exhale, step, inhale, pause, exhale. There was no separation now between observer and pattern, only alignment. The figure in the memory continued its walk, past the lamps, along the familiar line of the street, uninterrupted, unquestioned, and then a subtle shift, not in movement, but in presence. The figure did not vanish. It did not stop. It simply became lighter, less defined, as though time itself had begun to loosen its hold. The steps remained, but the form that created them began to fade. Step, pause, step, pause. Holmes's eyes opened slowly. The room returned, the embers, the shadows, the quiet, but the understanding remained, not as a conclusion, not as a solved mystery, but as a recognition that required no further proof. Across the room, John Watson shifted faintly in his sleep, his breathing steady, untouched by what had just passed. Holmes turned slightly, his gaze resting briefly upon him. There was comfort in that, in the simplicity of unbroken rest. He returned his attention to the window. Outside, the fog drifted as it always had. The street lay calm, and yet the footsteps continued, unchanged, unfading. Step, pause, step, pause. Holmes no longer sought their source. He no longer traced their path. He allowed them to exist exactly as they were, a continuation, a repetition, a memory made sound. He moved slowly back toward his chair, each step quiet, deliberate, echoing the same measured calm. The chair received him once more, familiar, steady. He rested his hands lightly upon the armrests, his posture relaxed, his presence at ease. The clock marked another passing minute. Tick, inhale, tick, exhale, and beneath it, step, pause, step, pause. Holmes' gaze softened, not focused on anything in particular, but resting within the quiet space of the room. There was nothing more to pursue, nothing more to uncover. Some patterns did not end. They simply continued, carried forward not by necessity, but by repetition. And as the night moved gently onward within Baker Street, the rhythm remained, steady, familiar, and no longer alone. The night had grown softer, not darker, but deeper. Within 221 Baker Street, the last glow of the embers rested low and quiet, like a fading echo of warmth, rather than a source of light. The room no longer cast shadows that moved. Everything had settled into stillness. Sherlock Holmes sat in his chair once more, composed, his presence as calm as the air around him. Across from him, Dr. John Watson slept without interruption. The rhythm of his breathing had become deeper now, slower, as though he had drifted far from waking thought. His rest carried quiet certainty, undisturbed, complete. Tick, inhale, tick, exhale, and beneath it, step, pause, step, pause. The footsteps had not faded. They had settled, no longer distant, no longer approaching, simply present. Holmes did not turn toward the window. He did not need to. The sound existed clearly enough without sight. He reached slowly toward the small table beside him, where his violin rested. His fingers moved with familiarity, lifting it gently, as though careful not to disturb the silence it was about to join. The bow followed. A quiet breath passed through him, not preparation, but alignment. For a moment he did nothing. He listened. To the rhythm, to the space between, to the steady continuation that required no explanation. Then, softly, he began to play. The first note was low, barely there. It did not interrupt the silence. It entered it. A single tone, drawn slowly, stretching itself across the quiet, like a thread of sound woven into stillness. The footsteps continued, unchanged. Step, pause, step, pause. Holmes adjusted, not consciously, but naturally. The second note followed, not in contrast, but in agreement, long, even, measured. The violin did not lead, it followed, each note placed gently within the spaces between the steps, filling the pauses without overwhelming them. Step, note, pause, note, step, note, pause, note. The two rhythms began to merge. Not perfectly, not precisely, but comfortably, as though they had always belonged together. Holmes's eyes softened, his gaze unfocused, resting somewhere beyond the room. The melody remained simple. No sudden changes, no rising intensity, only a slow progression of tones that repeated, shifted slightly, and returned again. A pattern, like the footsteps, like the clock, like breathing. Across from him, Watson stirred faintly, not waking, but responding. His breathing adjusted, subtly aligning with the combined rhythm of step and sound. Tick, inhale, note, exhale, step, pause. The room seemed to expand, not physically, but in feeling, as though the boundaries between sound and silence had softened. Outside, the fog drifted. Inside, the melody continued. Holmes did not think. He did not analyze. He simply allowed the music to exist, shaped not by intention, but by presence. Each note carried the same quiet certainty as the steps beyond the window. No beginning, no end, only continuation. The violin grew softer still, the notes lengthening, stretching further into the spaces between. The footsteps did not change. They did not respond. And yet, they remained in quiet conversation with the sound. Step, pause, step, pause, note, fade, note, fade. Holmes's hand moved steadily, the bow gliding across the strings with minimal pressure, producing tones that seemed to hover rather than sound. The melody circled back upon itself, repeating with slight variation, never breaking, never demanding attention, only offering it. Time passed, though it could not be measured. The clock continued, but its presence had softened, absorbed into the greater rhythm that now filled the room. Watson slept, unaware, and yet, perhaps, not entirely untouched. Holmes allowed the final sequence of notes to slow further, each one extending just a little longer than the last. The footsteps remained, constant, patient, unchanged. Then, gently, the music faded, not ending, but dissolving. The final note lingered, then slipped quietly into silence. Holmes lowered the bow. The violin rested once more against his shoulder for a brief moment, as though reluctant to leave the space it had shared. Then slowly, he lowered it back to the table. The room returned, the embers, the quiet, the steady breathing, and beneath it, step, pause, step, pause. Nothing had been resolved, nothing had been altered, and yet something had settled. Holmes leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed, his presence at ease. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to remain within the rhythm, to allow it to continue without interruption. Outside, along Baker Street, the unseen path carried on, step, pause, unbroken, unhurried, and now, accompanied. The night had reached its quietest depth, not the beginning of darkness, but its most settled form. Within 2201B Baker Street, the embers had dimmed to their faintest glow, a soft red beneath a thin veil of ash. The room no longer held light in any strong sense, only the memory of it. Sherlock Holmes remained seated, still and composed, his eyes now closed. He did not sleep, but he no longer observed. He simply existed within the rhythm that had come to define the night. Across from him, Dr. John Watson rested deeply, his breathing slow and even, untouched by interruption. Tick, inhale, tick, exhale, and beneath it, step, pause, step, pause. The sounds had blended now, no longer separate, no longer layered, but unified, as though each had found its place within a greater whole. Outside, Baker Street lay wrapped in a calm that felt complete. The fog had begun to thin, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The gas lamps stood clearer now, their light stretching just a little further across the cobblestones. The outlines of buildings returned in soft detail, no longer swallowed entirely by mist. The street remained empty, and yet not empty. The footsteps continued their path, unseen, but present, tracing the same quiet line as before. Step, pause, step, pause. Further along the street, beyond the reach of 2021B's window, small signs of the coming dawn began to gather. Not light, not yet, but a subtle change in stillness. A shift so gentle it could only be felt. A bakery door, closed hours before, rested quietly in the distance. A lone carriage stood still at the far end of the road, its shape barely visible, its presence forgotten for the night. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Holmes remained unmoving. His breathing had slowed further, matching the rhythm not just of the footsteps, but of the entire night around him. Step, inhale, pause, exhale, step, inhale, pause, exhale. There was no distinction now between the inside and the outside, no boundary between observer and world. Only continuation, the pattern held, unbroken. And as it continued, something else began to emerge, not from the footsteps, but alongside them, a fading, not of sound, but of presence. The steps remained clear, but their weight seemed lighter, their contact softer, as though whatever had once walked that path had moved further away, not in distance, but in time. Holmes's expression remained unchanged, calm, accepting. He did not follow the thought. He did not pursue its meaning. He allowed it to pass, just as the footsteps passed along the street. Beyond the window, the fog thinned further. The shapes of the street grew clearer still. The lamps dimmed slightly, their purpose nearing its end, and the sky, though still dark, held the faintest suggestion of change, not light. But the absence of complete darkness, The world was preparing, quietly, gradually, without announcement, and still, step, pause, step, pause. The rhythm continued, steady, certain, but now beginning to soften, not in pattern, not in timing, but in presence, like an echo that had traveled far and was slowly reaching its final distance. Holmes opened his eyes, not fully. Just enough. The room returned to him, the dim embers, the stillness, the quiet form of Watson resting nearby. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had moved forward. He listened once more. Carefully, gently, the footsteps were still there, but they no longer filled the space as they had before. They passed through it, lightly, fading, step, pause, step, pause, further now, softer, less angered. Holmes exhaled slowly, his breath barely visible in the coolness of the early hour. There was no need to follow, no need to confirm. The pattern had completed what it needed to. Not by ending, but by continuing beyond perception. Outside, the street grew clearer. The fog lifted just enough to reveal the empty path where the footsteps had always been. And for a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement, only the quiet before morning. Holmes did not react. He remained still, allowing the absence to settle as naturally as the presence had. Behind him, Watson slept on, unaware of the shift, unaware of the fading, and within Baker Street, the night prepared to give way, slowly, gently, without disturbance, as all things did. And though the footsteps had nearly passed beyond hearing, their rhythm remained, not in sound, but in memory, steady, unbroken, and quietly at rest. Morning did not arrive all at once. It unfolded, gently, quietly, as though careful not to disturb what remained of the night. Within 220 Baker Street, the darkness softened into a pale gray light that filtered slowly through the window. The outlines of the room returned first. The chair, the table, the quiet form of Dr. John Watson, resting undisturbed. The embers in the fireplace had faded almost completely now, their warmth reduced to the faintest trace. The air carried a gentle coolness, not unpleasant, but fresh, like the beginning of something new. Sherlock Holmes sat as he had through the night, still, composed, awake. His eyes were open now, though not sharply focused. He did not look outward immediately. Instead, he remained for a moment within the quiet space between night and morning, where neither had fully taken hold. The clock continued, tick, inhale, tick, exhale, but something was missing. Not abruptly, not noticeably, just absent. Holmes listened. Carefully, patiently. There were no footsteps, no distant rhythm, no quiet pattern beneath the surface of sound. Only the room, only the morning, only the steady continuation of ordinary time. He did not move. He did not question. He allowed the absence to exist as naturally as the presence had. Across from him, Watson stirred. A small shift at first, then a deeper breath. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the softened light that now filled the room. For a moment he remained still, as though unsure whether he had truly awakened. Then he spoke, his voice low, touched with the calm of sleep. "Is it morning?" Holmes turned his gaze slightly toward him. Yes. Watson blinked, sitting up just enough to take in the room. The quiet felt different now, lighter, perhaps, or simply clearer. He listened. Then, after a pause, "It is gone." Holmes inclined his head slightly. Yes. There was no disappointment in the words, no sense of loss, only acknowledgement. Watson exhaled slowly, resting back into his chair, though no longer asleep. "For a moment," he said quietly, I thought I might still hear it. Holmes's gaze drifted briefly toward the window, where the light had grown just a little stronger. So did I. The two sat in silence, not searching, not waiting, simply present. Outside, Baker Street had begun to wake. The fog had lifted almost entirely now, leaving the street clear and gently lit. A distant door opened somewhere along the road. A faint sound of movement, early, unhurried, began to return to the world. A carriage wheel turned slowly in the distance. A voice, quiet and indistinct, passed briefly through the air. Life resumed, as it always did. Holmes rose at last, his movements slow, unforced. He stepped toward the window and looked out, not searching for what had been, but observing what was. The cobblestones lay bare, undisturbed. No trace of footsteps remained, no mark, no sign, only the path itself. He stood there for a moment, his expression unchanged. Behind him, Watson watched quietly, saying nothing more. Holmes rested a hand lightly against the window frame, his gaze steady. There was nothing to conclude, nothing to record, nothing to solve, and yet something had been understood. Not through evidence, not through deduction, but through presence, through listening, through allowing a pattern to reveal itself without interruption. Holmes turned slightly, stepping back into the room. The light had grown warmer now, filling the space where shadows had once rested. Watson stretched lightly, the last traces of sleep leaving him. "A curious thing," he said. Holmes gave the faintest nod. "Yes." Watson paused, then added softly, "Do you think it will return?" Holmes considered the question, not deeply, not analytically, but quietly. Then, "I believe," he said, "that it never truly left." Watson frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in thought. Holmes continued, his voice calm, even. "Some patterns do not belong to a single moment. They persist, whether we hear them or not." Watson's expression softened. He understood, not completely, but enough. The room grew brighter still, the day now fully arriving. Holmes returned to his chair, sitting once more, though now facing the light rather than the fading embers. The clock continued its steady rhythm, tick, 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 and though no footsteps followed, the space they had occupied remained, quiet, familiar, unbroken. Outside, Baker Street carried on. Inside, the morning settled, and within that calm, the memory of the night lingered, not as a mystery unresolved, but as something gently accepted, a rhythm once heard, a pattern once known, now resting just beyond sound. And as the day began within 2021 Baker Street, nothing more was required, no answers, no conclusions, only the quiet understanding that some things are not meant to be solved, only listened to and remembered.